رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So inshallah, before we dive in, I would like to briefly share really the reason why I chose this title, Riding the Tech Wave, Aligning Incentives with Ethical Governance. So like most of us, I too found myself wondering over the past year, what's really all this hype behind around AI? Is this is it just another buzzword, or is there something truly transformative that's happening here? And to explore that question, I picked up this book titled The Coming Wave by Mustafa Sulaiman, who's the current CEO of Microsoft AI, but also he's the founder of Google's DeepMind. And the book explores how powerful and transformative technologies like AI and synthetic biology is reshaping our industries as well as our institutions. And as I was reading the book, one idea that really stood out was that our challenge really isn't to resist the technological wave, but instead learn to ride it responsibly. And that phrase right there, riding the wave responsibly, really defines the spirit of our discussion today. So inshallah, with that framing in mind, let's look at our agenda today. Salman, the slides moving fine? Okay. So inshallah, we'll begin by first understanding the concept of the wave and what it really means in the context of major technological shifts. We'll then touch on some of the key phrases that author used in his book related to the technologies, and those terms are proliferation and containment. We'll then dive into incentives, things that really make a wave or a technology accelerate faster than our ability to control it. We'll also look at the guiding principles for responsible containment, really a framework for leaders to ride this wave responsibly. We'll then move on to touch two strategic levers that author discusses for containment. Those are reshaping incentives and managing choke points. And then we'll also walk through 10 steps towards containment, a structured approach that author mentioned for managing technological acceleration. And finally, we'll close some key takeaways and then open the floor for our discussion. So I'm roughly estimating that the first 6 points will probably take us like around 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. So my humble request is that we hold off on any questions and comments until we get to the open discussion, and we'll have some healthy discussions then. Few disclaimers, though, before we begin. This by no means is an endorsement either for the book or the author. I know there's been some protest against the author, or at least the stage where he was speaking at, which happened to be a Microsoft stage, in regards to how AI was being used or is being used against our brothers and sisters in Gaza. So I wanted to make a disclaimer foremost that this by no means is an endorsement for the book or for the author. There's some good points in this book that we can draw some lessons from, and we'll just stick to that. We are also using the primary content from the slide is from the book, right? So, and I just wanted to state that upfront that, and I cited the author and the book on the title slide just to avoid any accusation of plagiarism. And then this is by no means a deep dive technical session on AI or synthetic biology. We've had some of those sessions in the past on mine. You guys can go back and look at those. But this discussion is really around governance and how we can manage these technologies responsibly. And one of the latest slides, I believe it's slide 12 or 13, talks about a total of 10 containment steps, which are directly from the book, right? And obviously no claims are being made here that these are the only steps. You guys might be reading some of the books, and they might have some other recommendations that we can draw lessons from. And inshallah, if you have any of those that you wanted to bring forward during our discussion segment, please feel free to do that. And lastly, our ultimate guidance, as you know, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if there's anything in the book or in the slide that deviates from that overall guidance, then we obviously ignore that, and then we stick to our ultimate guidance. that we get from Adi. So with that, let's begin, inshallah. So when the author talks about the phrase "the wave," he's actually referring to those moments in human history when technology fundamentally altered the course of civilization. When it doesn't really just change what we do and how we do things, but in fact, who we become. Right. So think back to some of the turning points or inflection points in our history. Examples that author used in the book are the discovery of fire, the invention of wheel, printing press, steam engine, harnessing of electricity. In recent decade or centuries, like internet and smartphones, so on and so forth. So each of those moments really completely redefined what was possible. Right. It changed the economies, societies, and the very rhythm of daily life. And what the author is setting the stage here is he's saying that something similar is about to happen. And mind you, the book was written back in 2023, and we are here in 2025 discussing the book. So some of the concepts or I guess phrases that the author uses, next wave, or things coming up, everyone knows here that we're already in the midst of that wave. So but I wanted to be true to the phrases and the text that we use from the book, and just to be authentic, just to stay honest to the content that we're using from the book. So, but then the author introduces that there are two technologies mainly, but then there's also additional technologies he mentioned, that our future is will be shaped and is already being shaped by artificial intelligence as well as biotechnology, particularly synthetic biology. And these technologies aren't really incremental improvements, but they are transformational forces, right? And they're capable of reshaping entire systems. It's already changing how we work and govern today using AI, to all the way to how we understand life itself, right, using synthetic biology. And obviously, the benefits are really vast and profound, right? We now have smarter systems. We have great medical breakthroughs because of these underlying technologies. But the gist of the book is to highlight that the dangers are equally vast and profound, right? For example, AI, using AI, we can create autonomous systems that operate beyond our control, making decisions that we might not fully understand. Right. Just use any example that if we lean completely on the technology and we don't even understand how decisions are being made, there's a profound risk inherently with that technology. Similarly, with biotechnology, it's actually rewriting the very code of life. The author argues with the consequences we can't really fully predict. But right here, I wanted to. This was the idea that I wanted to mention, that the ultimate guidance comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So nothing happens without the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though the author is arguing that we can use the technology to change the building blocks of life, right? It's only to the extent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows humans to do that. So just keep that in mind. And so here, the central question isn't really whether this wave will come. We're already in the midst of that wave, right? It's already moving, but how prepared we are to ride this responsibly, right? And that challenge of preparedness really what author is focusing on, and he uses two terms to define that. One word is one keyword or key term is proliferation, and the other one is containment problem. So every technology follows the same pattern, right? Once it's discovered, the default is that it spreads, it proliferates, right? As cost decreases and access to those technology increases, innovation moves much faster than even the original creator, or I guess the inventor of that technology even imagined. And that speed fuels progress, but it also makes control nearly impossible, right? So historically, just think about printing press all the way to internet. The speed with which everything was moving, it was almost impossible to control it. And then the author introduces, I guess, talks about containment. And here, the argument really isn't that with the word containment to contain I guess, to stop innovation, but it's about meaningful control, right? Preventing misuse of this technology by harmful actors without really blocking advancement. And here the author actually uses an example that none of the technologies in the history were contained, with the exception of nuclear power. And I actually disagreed with that, because if I have access to a harmful technology and I'm controlling others to have it, that's not really a true containment based on the ethics, right? So if I have access to nuclear power, but I don't want others to have it, is that really containment? It's not, right? But again, just to be true to the content of the book, that's what the author mentioned, that there's an exception to the containment issue, and nuclear technology was used as an example. So today there are many driving factors, but the fact is that innovation moves much faster than our capacity, or I would argue that even our willingness to govern it. And that widening gap between speed and control really defines the central or core dilemma of our time. Author then moves on to introduce the technology which we already covered on, I guess, some of the technologies on the earlier slide. But the next wave, again, think the current wave, because the book was written in 2023, and let's just be realistic that the wave is already here. But it comprises of three different technologies. The technology of intelligence itself, which is artificial intelligence, the technology of life, synthetic biology, and a wider wave, which has a combination of technologies like robotics, quantum computing, and nanotechnology. The book also talks about there are four characteristics or traits of these technologies that's making this wave unlike any other in the past, anything else that happened in the history, right? And then the first characteristic is asymmetric impact. Now, individuals can influence markets or systems once controlled only by the entire government, right? So there's an imbalance in the power. If a single individual might be able to create like a virus that just kills everyone, or I guess kills a wide group of people, right? So that's really the imbalance that's being referred here. And then the second trait of the wave is the speed with which we are moving. So hyper-evolution, where progress is being made in versions and not really in decades. Omni-use, and this is not unique to this wave, right? The omni-use is, you can use the same engine to power progress, but you can also amplify risk using that same technology, depending on whose hands it's in. Just think of something simple as knife, right? You can use it to do something meaningful, but you can use it to harm someone. And lastly, autonomy. Now, think agentic AI when we talk about autonomy. Now, systems can act on their own and faster than we can even supervise it. And these four traits really make the next wave much faster, broader, and even harder to govern than anything in history. And that brings us to the real engine behind the wave. This is probably the core, or I guess the meat of the book. As I was reading the book was getting really theoretical, and I was actually wondering when we'll actually get to things that's driving it and what can we do to at least steer it in the right direction. So the incentives is really the core of what the author focuses on. Sometimes you wonder, right, that why does innovation keep happening even though when we know the risks with those innovation? And it really comes down to three forces. As you can see on the screen, it's state rivalry, right? Every nation state is competing for dominance and security. They don't really care about the benefit of the humanity. They are more concerned about getting that political powers. In a similar fashion, think corporations. For them, it's always about market share and getting more investors, getting more money, right? It's never about, regardless of how they claim their mission is, but the underlying incentive for them is always money. And similarly, researchers and institutions seek recognition and influence. And I don't want to make blanket statements. There are always exceptions, but I'm just saying overwhelming nations will lean towards gaining power. Corporations is after money, and then researchers to seek recognition. But again, there are always good and bad in each of these categories. So together, these three incentives form a self-reinforcing cycle, right? Government funds innovation, companies scale it, and scientists publish it, make it open source. So the author argues that the challenge here isn't technological, but it's more motivational. And these same incentives also explain why regulations alone can control this wave. For example, each of these incentives, rivalry, profit, and prestige, can actually accelerate innovation faster than regulation can respond. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Right? Governments are racing to stay ahead. And we'll touch on some of these as we get into the incentives in detail in one of the slides, upcoming slides. But the idea here is that governments always race to stay ahead. Companies move to commercialize. And scientists share discoveries openly because they wanted to get that reputation. And each one of those actions lowers the barrier to control. And traditional regulation simply can't really match with the speed with which these things are being done. So realistically, instead of trying to stop the wave, the answer here really is to reshape incentives and manage the choke points, really guiding how technology develops rather than trying to stifle it. And to do all this and to do this effectively, requires a framework grounded, a leadership framework grounded in three principles: strategy, governance, and stewardship. And riding the wave isn't really about learning to do things faster to keep up with the pace, right? It's also about balance. And these principles that you see on the screen, strategy, governance, and stewardship, really defines that balance. Strategy sets a direction. It answers the question, where are we steering the wave? It's about aligning innovation with ethical mission and long-term values, not really chasing every new trend. And governance, obviously, it's tied to putting right controls in place, right? And answering the question, how do we really steer a technological wave responsibly? It's about, again, accountability and balancing speed with safeguards. And lastly, stewardship is the conscience, right? The moral responsibility to ensure technology serves people, not just progress. So together, like the strategy should set the course for us. Governance should hold the line, and stewardship really defines the legacy. But the reality is these are just theoretical, right? But we also need to have some principles, which we'll get into next, as author gives us two strategic levers for containment of these specific technologies. And there are two, right? One is reshaping incentives, which means that we need to make responsibility profitable, right? Linking business success to ethical design and transparency, and so the market actually rewards accountability, not just money. And again, on one of the next slides, we'll look at the incentives in more detail, like how to realign these incentives. The second lever that author talks about is managing choke points. Here, choke points really mean the dependencies that each of these major technologies like AI and synthetic biology have. And we thought that, for example, AI doesn't really run on vacuum, right? I guess it needs underlying compute power, cloud access, and I don't know much about synthetic biology, but there needs to be some gene synthesis facilities where that these technologies are dependent on, right? So managing choke points really is to identify these dependencies so we can have oversight and leverage that oversight so we can slow risky proliferation just enough for governance and security technologies to catch up. And Together, these two levers, author argues, helps us steer the wave towards safety rather than just speed. Now let's dive a little bit deeper, because as I was reading the book, I was starting to question, okay, where can I actually add value, right? Because this is too theoretical. I'm not part of a nation state where I actually have some leverage, or I'm not a CEO of a major corporation. So where can I make some difference? And this slide is actually not directly from the book, but I was getting to a point where I needed to dig a little deeper on like how we can actually reshape the incentives, right? Um, so, and what you see here is basically like 3 or 4 or 5 areas where we can change the incentives wherever we are within the food chain, right? If you're working in a corporation or if you're working for an agency, that's where you need to start making a difference, right? So, for example, the traditionally performance metrics always celebrate speed, right? You get rewarded when you get things done faster, when you meet the deadlines, when you increase the output. But the whole idea of realignment based on the governance is that we also evaluate how results are being achieved, right? Did we follow the policy? Was the process of getting a project done, was that transparent? Um, did I lose? Salman, can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, no worries. Right. So just going back to the performance metrics, right? So we need to have some ethical guidelines also put into the performance metrics. So anyone who's working on a project, they realize that they will also be um, evaluated based on these new criterias, right? So similarly in budget and funding, historically, and this makes sense that the projects that get funded are really based on what's the ROI expected from that funding, and that makes sense. But what the argument here is that the governance alignment widens that lens, meaning that ROI still matters, but now we should align that with security readiness, right, and regulatory compliance. So we fund innovation that is both high value, but then also built on high integrity. So this way we ensure risk and value both move together. And and honestly, like I just want to be realistic again that some of these things might feel like these are too idealistic, but if we don't start thinking in that direction, then we're just going to fall way behind this way, right? And then obviously we need to have a seat on the table where we can make these calls, right? So I want each one of us to start thinking how I can apply this, and if I'm in a situation where I can apply these principles, right? And if not, what will it take for us to get to that stage where my input is being valued and I can make a difference, right? So now let's just move on to leadership evaluation. So this is one of the strongest levers we have, right? Instead of us promoting um, the fastest builder, meaning the top performer and biggest team, we should also promote leaders who demonstrate some sort of accountability, who build trust, and who delivers responsibly over the long term. It's not what you just deliver, but how you deliver it, right? So we need to start evaluations based on these criteria as well. And for the innovation program, and this one, I'm not in R&D, so this might be more applicable for anyone who's in research and development. But innovation programs are historically often rewarded based on boldness without boundaries, right? So if you move fast and break things, but eventually get where you need to, that's actually rewarded, as opposed to just moving fast, or I guess moving slow, and you're getting there, but you're getting it slower than your competitor, right? So that's um, by us introducing governance doesn't really mean we will kill speed, right? We just add discipline to it. So we move fast, but still do it safely. And we do this by adding some risk review gates at each of the, and they need to be lightweight, right, during the process. So this way, we still encourage creativity while keeping the organization protected. And lastly, AI and data governance. So right now, the criteria of evaluation is really based on accuracy, right? But I think we need to start moving from accuracy to even explainability, right? Being fair. So I think the fairness is being added, right? So if you look at ChatGPT, like a few years ago, and author actually mentions this in his book as well, that you could get a response that could be totally racial, right? And then, so with newer versions, that is changing, and so we need to put more emphasis on that, right? So explainability is just another metric that we can use, right? So where we can see how AI system, rather than just giving the response, it should also be able to explain why a particular decision was made, right? It gives us the transparency that we need to interpret the model's reasoning. Now, these are probably more at the individual organizational and corporation level, but the governance isn't really only internal, right? It also depends on how nations and industries manage access to the critical resources. So we talked about choke point. So this is where we're going next. And so we mentioned that choke points are really those pressure points, right, that each major technology is dependent on, and how can we leverage it. So we give some breathing room for governance and security technologies to catch up, right? And export control is just one real-world example of choke points in action. For example, in 2003 and 2020, 2023 and 2024, the U.S. Limited China's access to advanced AI chips, right? And China responded by restricting materials vital to chip making. So the author argues here that if these same levers can be used to gain political dominance or I guess market share, why can't we just use the same levers to create some breathing room for governance and safety frameworks to mature? But if you look at if you guys been reading news lately, it's clear that the incentives are still in the favor of speed and competitive advantage. And this is because we as Muslims, we don't really have a seat on the table where we can bring up these as concerns, right? So just this year, we've seen a series of record-breaking compute and chip deals. For example, OpenAI signed deal with both AWS and AMD to gain access to exactly those choke points that we could have leverage. Now they have access to these NVIDIA GPUs um, to I guess compete and I guess win over its competitor, right? Similarly, Microsoft signed a contract with Iron to secure access to these AI chips, again built on NVIDIA architecture, right? And Anthropic signed a deal with Google Cloud to gain access to their TPUs, which are their processor, right? So these deals really show that how compute and chip supply have become more of a strategic currency as opposed to the choke points that the author was arguing that we could have leverage back in 2023. So lastly, what author does is like he actually brings together all these different ideas into a more structured roadmap. And before I go into this, I want each one of us to think where we can leverage these steps and make a difference, right? Because not everything will be applicable to me or applicable to you. So the whole intent of this book and this session is really to see where we can actually make a difference. So let's look through them. So the first one is technical safety, R&D. So this means that we need to start, or I guess anyone who's working in that field needs to start investing in both AI and biosafety research, because these systems reach before these systems reach mass adoption, right? Not after, right? And most of these things are like pretty obvious. The next one was the audit. So we need to start having independent technical and ethical audits, giving leaders the visibility that they need to identify gaps and do something about it. And choke point, we already talked about choke point. These are really the strategic pressure points, but we just realized that you know it might be too late for us to do anything about this. You guys might disagree if you guys have a different perspective, and inshallah, we'll talk about that in the next segment. Um, the fourth one is, the author argues that rather than just sitting on the sideline and criticizing, we should be part of the process. We should become the makers. Now, obviously, this means that you need to have specialized skills to do this, but at least for the technologies that we've been discussing. But the whole idea is that we need to start thinking forward and should really be the part of the innovation process as Muslims, right? So um, we need to start embedding ourselves as ethicists, risk experts. If we are in governance or policy, we need to be part of the R&D teams. Now, for the business, the business side of the containment, again, this goes back to the alignment, right? It's about making responsibility profitable. So when companies tie their funding and market access to ethical and safety standards, then good governance really will stop being a cost and a roadblock, and will start to become a competitive advantage. But then again, we need to have a seat on the table, right? How many of us are actually in a C-level role in one of these major AI company or cloud providers? We are not, right? So I think that's really where we need to start thinking, how do we push ourselves into up the food chain so we can actually implement any of these. Similarly, for the governments, they should have played a unique role in containment. We should have set the rules that define how fast or how far technology can scale. But the challenge today is really there are multiple challenges. One is the ethical issues for folks in the government as well. Right? The leadership in power is far off from the basic ethics to begin with, right? But the other issue is that these public institutions normally move slower than the technologies they are meant to oversee. So unless you know enough about a technology, how can you adapt or put some regulations around it, right? So but that's where we Muslims should start thinking of, how do we get ourselves into into that circle where we can both know the technology, but then also be able to set some rules to go on. And then the seventh one is global alliances, and we've already talked about some of the export controls. So, right, rather than creating alliances, right, the countries and nation states, they are creating silos by doing these export controls. But the author's argument was that containment needs treaties, not silos, right? So global challenges will require shared standards, and then global alliances are really about creating standards. And then they also should share safeguards, lessons learned from one nation state to the other one, and they should share experience and expectations for how these technologies, the both like pros and cons of these technologies. So we need to have global alliances. The eighth one is culture of disclosure. Really, I guess what the author is saying here is that we need to have a culture of transparency over secrecy, and which I would argue is harder to achieve that because of the privacy of every corporation or every nation state. This will always be a challenge, but This is what the idealistic approach, or I guess steps that author was outlining. But we can just do the best in the areas we can, and then hope that we'll eventually get to a stage where everyone starts thinking about benefiting humanity as opposed to their own benefit, personal gains. Ninth one is civil movements. So here, this one is actually like pretty good because it's saying that governments and corporations can really be the only watchdogs. Right, so civil movements like research communities, NGOs, and advocacy groups should play a critical role in spotting risk and raising awareness and holding these corporations and governments accountable. And this might be an area where, where we can start thinking, how do we make a difference, right? If there are any experts on this call who can provide some guidance on that, I think that would really be helpful for mine in the long term. But this is really the focus, or I guess the recommendation from the author, that we should not just completely rely on governments and corporations to do the right thing. And the last one is the narrow path, right? The author calls this final step the narrow path. Basically, it's just a reminder that there are no shortcuts to responsible innovation, right? Containment isn't really a policy that you set and forget, but it's a discipline that we should practice continuously as technology grows. So I guess lastly, I'll just share some of the key takeaways, and then we'll inshallah open up for discussion. As we just saw, that incentives really drive proliferation, so governance must drive direction, right? So innovation will always push forward, for power, money, but our task as leaders is to make sure it moves in the right direction, right? It's aligned, like our values, incentives are really aligned with values and long-term purpose. And strategic choke point, again, we've already discussed this, but the key takeaway in general is if we learn about the choke points, we can actually leverage them before it's too late, right? But currently corporations are already exploiting them to gain their competitive advantage. So, and then containment succeeds only when safety and profit align, right? When we reward people for being responsible, and that really becomes a competitive advantage, right? Because if not, then everyone will strive to, just climb up the ladder, make more money, and then there's really no reward if for them to do the right thing, if doing the right thing is rewarded for them, right? And ultimately, this whole discussion is not about fear, or even when I was reading the book, at some point I was getting too pessimistic that, okay, what seems like, everything is coming to an end. But realistically, this wasn't really about fear. It's more about leadership. Where can we step up? So lastly, I guess I'll just say that wave is already here. So rather than resisting it, we should try to ride it with clarity and control. Now, actually, Salman, do you have anything you wanted to add before I open up for comments? Because I know you read this book recently as well, so I just want to see if you have any input. Okay. Right. So, I guess one thing I'll just say, right before we get into the discussion, that we should start really thinking as leaders or individual contributors, where do we have the most influence, right? And then the passion or skill sets to do it, right? So some of us might be working in organizations, or some of us might be working at the government level, right? So we should all start thinking as we get into this discussion that where can we add value, right? So I'll just open up at this point to see if others have read other books on the similar topic and there are any recommendations that contradicts what we learn here, or maybe there's something that we all can hear and learn from it. So with that, I'll pause and open up the floor for any comments or questions.